April 16, 2021. The 170th kilometer of the M5 Ural Highway in the Sverdlovsk region. A driver, who accidentally pulled off onto the roadside, notices a bright spot in the forest belt, a bright lemon-colored tracksuit. It was the body of a young woman. There were no signs of a struggle on her, and nearby, neither documents nor a phone. She looked as if someone had neatly brought her and laid her right among the melted snow. Later it will turn out, while the police across the country were trying to establish the identity of the unknown woman in yellow, ideal pictures of a beautiful life continued to appear on her social networks. And the person who knew exactly where she was located calmly woke up every day in their shared home and fed the pets. How did an ideal fairy tale on Instagram turn into a terrible tragedy in real life? And why did the finale of this story cause so much controversy and anger? Before we reconstruct the chronology of this high-profile case in detail, subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future investigations. Your support helps us continue our work. So, let's return to the very beginning of this story. Approximately 30 kilometers south of Yekaterinburg lies the Sysert district of the Sverdlovsk region, a quiet suburb where private houses are located among pine forests. It was here, in early 2021, in a small house with an area of just 40 square meters, that the life of the young married couple Zhuravlev, hidden from prying eyes, took place. The victim, 28-year-old Kristina Zhuravleva, a popular beauty and lifestyle blogger on the social network Instagram with tens of thousands of followers. Having a higher pedagogical education and graduating from the university with a red diploma with honors, Kristina decided to refuse work in her specialty and completely devote herself to creating content for social networks. Living with her was her 23-year-old husband, Dmitry Zhuravlev. In the past, Dmitry worked as a communications engineer, but later quit to help his wife maintain her blog. The couple lived together with 2 dogs, maintaining practically no personal contact with relatives and neighbors. However, behind the closed doors of this small house was hidden a reality absolutely opposite to the one demonstrated on screens. On April 16, 2021, a driver passing along the M5 Ural Highway in the Sysert district of the Sverdlovsk region stopped at the 170th kilometer and went into the forest belt. There, among the melted snow and dry grass, he was shocked to discover the body of a young woman in a bright lemon tracksuit. The man immediately called the police. At the scene of the incident, neither documents nor a mobile phone were discovered. For 2 weeks, none of her loved ones filed a missing person report. Only on April 30, 2021, when a search notice with a description of the victim's noticeable clothing spread across the media and social networks, did Dmitry Zhuravlev come to the police. He stated that his wife, Kristina Zhuravleva, had left home back in early April after a quarrel and had not returned. However, already in the first minutes of communication with the applicant, investigators had serious suspicions. Immediately after the call, an investigative operational group, including forensic experts and a forensic medical examiner, left for the site where the body was discovered at the 170th kilometer of the M5 Ural Highway. Law enforcement officers immediately cordoned off the adjacent section of the forest belt and proceeded with a detailed inspection of the area and the body itself. The initial inspection immediately gave the operatives to understand this was a matter of a crime. On the woman's body, signs of a struggle, defensive injuries on the hands, or signs of resistance were completely absent. The footwear was clean, which completely excluded the version that the girl had come into the dense forest on her own. The surrounding environment also indicated that the place of discovery was not the place of the killing. Everything looked as if the body had been neatly brought by car and left a few meters from the roadway. Additional suspicions were raised by the fact that the deceased was dressed in an expensive, well-groomed tracksuit, but she had neither a bag, nor keys, nor a phone on her. The taking of fingerprints and checking against databases at the scene yielded no results, and the skin changes recorded by the expert testified that the body had been lying in the forest for several days already. It became obvious, before the investigators was the victim of a carefully planned crime. Now the main task of law enforcement officers was to establish the identity of the deceased and track down those who attempted to hide her body. The work of the investigative operational group and forensic experts at the place where the body was discovered was carried out using the standard protocol for fixing physical evidence. Specialists conducted a step-by-step inspection of the adjacent territory, photo and video recording, as well as the collection of soil and biological samples. During the inspection of the soil and vegetation within a radius of several meters from the body, experts did not discover pronounced drag marks, footwear prints of third parties, or obvious tire tracks leading directly to the location of the body. This indicated that the body was carried manually from the roadway. On the clothing of the deceased itself, the bright yellow tracksuit, there were no signs of tears, dirt, or other damage characteristic of dynamic resistance. To establish the exact cause and time of death, the body was sent to the Bureau of Forensic Medical Examination. In the course of the post-mortem examination, experts recorded the following key facts. Cause of death. According to the conclusion of the forensic medical examination, death occurred as a result of mechanical asphyxia strangulation. On the soft tissues of the neck, characteristic subcutaneous hemorrhages and damage indicating compression of the neck organs by hands were discovered. Trajectory and injuries. No fractures, stab or cut wounds, traumatic brain injuries, or other signs of ante-mortem infliction of severe bodily harm were revealed on the body of the deceased. Defensive biological samples or traces of the attacker's epithelium were absent on the hands and under the nail plates, which testified to the absence of an active phase of self-defense. Time of death. Based on the analysis of post-mortem changes, the state of the tissues, and the ambient temperature, experts established that death occurred 10 to 14 days prior to the moment the body was discovered, that is, in the first days of April 2021. Toxicological analysis. The results of laboratory examination of blood and tissues for the presence of alcohol, narcotic, sedative, or potent medicinal substances came back negative. The aggregate of the obtained forensic and medical data allowed the investigation to reach a clear conclusion. The crime was committed in an enclosed space long before the discovery of the body, after which the deceased was transported to the forest belt. From that moment on, the task facing the investigators was to correlate the findings of the expertise with the statements of loved ones and establish the real timeline of the last days of Christina's life. After receiving the results of the forensic medical examination and the official establishment of the deceased's identity, the investigation of the criminal case entered an active phase. Facing the operational investigative group of the Investigative Committee and the Criminal Investigation Department was the task to reconstruct in detail the last days of Christina Zhuravleva's life, determine her social circle, and verify all possible versions of what occurred. Formulation of primary hypotheses. At the initial stage, the investigation considered several standard versions. Attack with the purpose of robbery, or on sexual grounds. The version quickly became doubtful, as the clothing on the victim was neatly buttoned. The expertise revealed no signs of sexual violence, and the very fact of the absence of personal belongings could be an attempt to complicate identification. Conflict related to public activity. As a popular blogger, Christina interacted with a large audience daily. Investigators studied probable threats, hater comments, and personal messages on social networks. However, no direct indications of the presence of real enemies or stalkers were discovered. A crime committed within the inner circle. According to criminalistic statistics, in the absence of a struggle and external injuries, key attention is paid to the closest people. The spouse of the deceased, Dmitry Zhuravlev, came under special surveillance. Analysis of digital data and billing tone. To verify Dmitry's alibi and establish the exact timeline of events, the investigation ordered a complex of forensic examinations of digital media and cellular operator data. Analysis of call detail records and the activity of Christina's SIM card showed that her phone completely stopped accessing the network and transmitting data in the first days of April. At the same time, pre-scheduled posts and stories continued to be published on her social networks over the next few days, which initially created the illusion of her presence online. In parallel, investigators requested the billing for Dmitry Zhuravlev's mobile phone. Comparison of the geographical coordinates of his SIM card's movement with the timeline of events revealed significant discrepancies. In the period between the estimated date of Christina's death early April and the day the body was discovered, Dmitry's phone was recorded several times by base stations serving the area of the 170th kilometer of the M5 Ural highway, specifically at night. During questioning, Dmitry claimed that on those days he did not travel outside his village and stayed at home. Study of video surveillance camera recordings. Investigators conducted large-scale work to collect and analyze video recordings from surveillance cameras installed at the exits of the cottage community, as well as at gas stations and road infrastructure facilities along the M5 highway. When studying the archives for the period from April 5 to April 9th, the attention of operatives was drawn to a characteristic passenger car belonging to the family. In several fragments of video recordings, it was captured how the vehicle left the village late at night and headed toward the forest area where the body was later discovered. Analysis of financial status and social behavior cells. In parallel with the technical check, operatives studied the domestic and financial lifestyle of the family. Interviews with acquaintances and analysis of bank accounts showed that in recent months the couple had been in a deep financial crisis. There were large credit debts, and the main income from blogging activity had decreased significantly. In addition, the attention of the investigation was drawn to Dmitry's strange behavior after the disappearance of his wife. For almost 2 weeks he made no attempts to search. He did not contact search and rescue teams, did not call her friends and relatives, and did not file a police report, right up until the moment the search notice for the found body received wide publicity in the regional media. The combination of circumstantial evidence, digital data, and contradictions in the initial explanations allowed the investigation to narrow down the circle of suspects to one person and proceed to the stage of direct investigative actions. Sufficient evidence had been gathered to summon Dmitry Zhuravlev for a second, more detailed interrogation. On April 30th, 2021, immediately after Dmitry Zhuravlev appeared at the police station with an official statement about the disappearance of his wife, operational officers made the decision on his immediate detention. By this moment, the investigation already had a sufficient array of evidence to grant him the procedural status of a suspect. The detention took place directly inside the building of the Intermunicipal Department of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, Sisersky, without the use of physical force or special means. At the moment when the investigator announced to Dmitry that he was being detained under Article 91 of the Criminal Procedure Code of the Russian Federation on suspicion of committing murder, the man offered no resistance. Witnesses and participants of the investigative action noted the outer calmness and emotional detachment of the detainee. Dmitry expressed no surprise, did not protest, and did not attempt to put forward alternative versions of what occurred. To the proposal to exercise the right not to testify against himself, he answered with a refusal and declared his readiness to cooperate with the investigation. On the same day, accompanied by sober officers and criminal investigation operatives, the detainee was delivered to his place of residence in a private house to conduct a primary search and a verification of statements on site. During transportation and the conduct of investigative actions, Dmitry maintained a depressed but absolutely submissive behavior, consistently following all instructions of the investigator. Being in the investigator's office, Dmitry Zhuravlev made the decision to speak and recount in detail the events that occurred in their house in early April. The interrogation of Dmitry Zhuravlev took place in the office of the District Department of the Investigative Committee. Opposite the investigator sat a young man who, from the very beginning of the investigative action, waived the rights provided by Article 51 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation and expressed readiness to give detailed statements without attempts to evade responsibility. Investigators applied the tactic of consistent presentation of evidence, from fixing his movements on video cameras to mobile billing data. Seeing that any attempts at concealment were meaningless, Dmitry quickly abandoned the initial version that Christina simply left home after a quarrel. The tension in the office reached its peak when the investigator asked a direct question about the events of April 5. The detainee paused, looked down at the desk and uttered, We started arguing again because of money and taxi calls. She was screaming, insulting me. At some point, I simply couldn't stand it. Everything happened too quickly. I didn't want this, but nothing could be changed anymore. During the interrogation, Dimitri's psychological state changed from complete numbness to quiet emotional outbursts. He described in detail not only the moment of the conflict itself, but also how for 4 days he remained in the same house with the body of his deceased wife, tried to improvise by hiding it in the bathroom, and frantically thought about what to do next. The psychological contact established by the investigator and the weight of continuous fear of exposure that had been pressing on the suspect for 3 weeks led to Zhuravlev making a confession of guilt and agreeing to a full reconstruction of the crime scene. Having received the confession statements, the investigative group immediately left for the crime scene to perform a verification of statements on site. After receiving the confession statements and conducting the verification on site, the task facing the investigation was to procedurally secure the available data with objective evidence. To form an evidentiary base for the charge of intentional murder, Part 1 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, a complex of forensic examinations and investigative actions was conducted. In the course of a second and more detailed search of the spouse's house, forensic experts using an expert light source and chemical reagents discovered traces of biological origin in the bathroom, despite attempts at their thorough washing. DNA examination confirmed that these traces belonged to the deceased. In addition, microparticles of fibers from Christina's clothing were seized from the trunk lining of the family car, as well as soil samples identical in composition to the soil from the 170th kilometer of the M5 highway. A substantial role was played by physical evidence of a digital nature. Data from video surveillance cameras that recorded the departure of the car from the cottage community on the night the body was carried out. Financial documentation and bank statements confirming the presence of critical debt and a deep financial conflict. Camera recordings in 24-hour stores where the accused bought cleaning products and packaging materials. Interrogated as witnesses were neighbors who confirmed the couple's secluded lifestyle and systematic domestic conflicts, as well as the driver who discovered the body. The aggregate of direct and circumstantial evidence, the results of genotyposcopic, trace evidence, and forensic medical examinations allowed for the complete exclusion of the version of a staging or the involvement of third parties. The preliminary investigation authorities formed an exhaustive volume of evidence confirming the guilt of the accused, after which the criminal case with an approved indictment was sent to court. The case went to the Sisert District Court, where the trial that the whole country was watching began. Court hearings in the case of the murder of blogger Kristina Zhuravleva took place in the Sisert District Court of the Sverdlovsk region and caused a widespread response. The session was held under the chairmanship of a judge in an open mode, with strict adherence to security measures. During the judicial debates, the state prosecution took a tough and uncompromising position. The prosecutor emphasized the particular cynicism of the committed crime. The accused not only deprived a close person of life, but also for several days continued to imitate an ordinary life, keeping the body in the house, and then insensitively transported it out to a forest belt like household garbage. The position of the prosecution was unequivocal. The correction of the defendant is possible only under conditions of isolation from society. The defense, in turn, focused the court's attention on mitigating circumstances, full admission of guilt and active contribution to solving the crime. An executed confession of guilt, absence of a criminal record, and positive references from the place of residence. A state of severe emotional stress caused by a prolonged financial and psychological crisis in the family. The lawyer insisted on reclassifying the actions of the defendant under a less severe article, or imposing a punishment not associated with maximum terms of deprivation of liberty. Dmitry Zhuravlev himself kept restrained in his final statement, repeatedly stating repentance and readiness to bear punishment. Having heard the positions of the parties and examined the materials of the case in detail, the court found Dmitry Zhuravlev guilty of committing the crime provided for by Part 1 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, murder. the court sentenced him to 8 years of deprivation of liberty to serve his sentence in a strict regime penal colony. The sentence entered into legal force, drawing a legal line under the tragic conclusion of this story. The judicial process is complete. However, outside the framework of the protocols remained the main question: how did an outwardly prosperous family arrive at such a catastrophic finale? The death of Kristina Zhuravleva and the subsequent trial sparked widespread discussion on social networks and in the media. For hundreds of thousands of subscribers who followed Kristina's bright blog, the tragedy came as a shock. Behind the aesthetic frames of ideal suburban life hid a destructive reality. The public reaction to the handed-down sentence turned out to be mixed. Criticism of the leniency of the sentence. On social networks and in comment sections, many considered 8 years of deprivation of liberty to be too lenient a punishment for intentional murder and subsequent actions to conceal the body. The position of lawyers, legal scholars and experts noted that the assigned term lies within the framework of standard practice for Part 1 of Article 105 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, in the presence of such mitigating circumstances as a confession of guilt, active assistance to the investigation, and the absence of a criminal record. Kristina's mother and her few close ones endured the process in a state of deep grief, preferring to refrain from public scandals and loud statements in the press. The story of the Zhuravlevs became a painful reminder for society of how much the facade created on social networks can differ from real life, full of hidden conflicts and psychological pressure. Concluding the chronicle of events, it is necessary to look at what happened through the prism of the main lessons of this tragedy. 8 years of deprivation of liberty in a strict regime penal colony. Precisely such a period was put to this case by the court, taking into account both the severity of the committed crime and the confession of guilt. Do you consider this sentence to be proportionate and fair for a taken human life and an attempt to hide what was done? Or should mitigating circumstances in such cases not play a key role? What in this story raises the greatest number of questions for you? Share your opinion and observations in the comments. But besides the legal side, another important question remains. What conclusions should society draw from this tragedy? The story of Kristina and Dmitry Zhuravlev is not just another line in a crime chronicle, but a cruel illustrative model of how a prolonged internal crisis and an illusory perception of reality are capable of destroying human lives. The main lesson of this tragedy lies in the danger of a deep gap between an artificially created external image and the real state of affairs. The desire to conform to an ideal picture on social networks in the presence of unpaid debts, the lack of permanent work, and growing emotional burnout created colossal psychological pressure. When audience approval and an aesthetic facade become the main priorities, internal problems are not solved, but merely masked, turning into a destructive mental trap. This drama exposes another, more everyday truth. Systematic emotional and financial exhaustion inevitably leads to the destruction of personality. Accumulated grievances, mutual reproaches, and the absence of timely help, whether psychotherapy or a simple conversation without masks, are capable of turning a domestic conflict into a point of no return. An impulsive decision made in a second of flared aggression instantly erased two fates. One life was irrevocably taken, the second was trampled by its own hands and surrendered behind bars. There are no winners here. All that remains are destroyed families, the incurable pain of a mother, and the deafening wall of realization that the mistake made can never be undone. This is a silent reminder to everyone. No social roles or virtual success are worth sacrificing real mental health and the safety of loved ones. Ahead lies only the final chord, saying goodbye to this story and its victim. Kristina Zhuravleva left behind hundreds of bright photographs filled with light, aesthetics, and dreams of happiness. But behind this flawless storefront hid a quiet tragedy that played out behind closed doors and ended on a remote roadside of a country road. A reminder of how easy it is to lose oneself in pursuit of an ideal image, and how high the price of silent despair can be. The story of Christina and Dmitry is a wrong turn from which there is no longer a way back. If this material resonated with you, was useful, or made you think about something important, support this release. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with those dear to you. Your comments and attention help us continue working on honest, objective, and deep documentary investigations. Take care of yourselves, be attentive to your loved ones, and do not be afraid to be real. Until we meet in the next release.